Psalms 137, verses 1 through 4. The second one will be Psalms 126, 1 through 3. Psalms 137, 1 through 4, and I'll be reading out of the New King James. By the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down, yea, we wept. When we remembered Zion, we hung our harps upon the willows in the midst of it. For there those who carried us away captive asked of us a song, and those who plundered us requested mirth, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? Psalms 126, 1 through 3. When the Lord brought back the captivity of Zion, we were like those who dream. Then our mouth was filled with laughter, and our tongue was singing. Then they said among the nations, The Lord has done great things for them. The Lord has done great things for us, and we are glad.
Thank you for reading that. Tonight I want us to kind of examine the question, how do we actually know when someone loves us? When is the exact moment when we understand that someone cares for us deeply? This is something we wonder a lot. I remember being in high school and this torments you when you're young. What are they thinking about me? What you can't see behind someone else's eyes, but how do you know if someone else cares about you? And so I'd like you to take a moment and really ask yourself, when was an exact moment in your life when you knew that someone loved you and there was no doubt at all? When you were totally convinced that another person cared for you deeply? Now, was it when someone just said the words, I love you? Or was it when someone showed you something? Did they demonstrate their love for you and you understood it beyond a shadow of a doubt that this person truly and completely loves you? Because we need to ask the question, can we really take something for granted and love it? Now, I know it's one thing to be married and we often take spouses and friends and family for granted. We still have love for them, but in the exact moment that we're taking them for granted, do we love them? Do they feel loved by us? Because as we go through the Old Testament, what we have to understand is that God's interactions with Israel was one in which he was rejected again and again, and Israel took him for granted over and over and over. Now, God told Israel that he loves them. But when God showed Israel that he loves them, they understood it more deeply. And so in order for us to believe God, because we're limited human beings, he has to show us. He can't just tell us. We can't just have 2,000 pages of God saying, I love you over and over and over again. By verse 7, you'd be numb to it. You couldn't even feel it. But God shows you that he loves you. He demonstrates that he loves you. And tonight I'd like us to look at these two Psalms. Psalm 137 was written about the time when they very first went into captivity. And then we're going to talk very briefly about what went on during the captivity. And then Psalm 126 was written about the time when they came out of captivity. And what we see are two very different psalms. We see people who are arrogant, people who don't understand what's happening to them when they very first go down, but when they're coming out, they're glad and they rejoice and they feel that God loves them because God has demonstrated this. So let's read this real quick. Psalm 137, it's not very long. Psalm 137 says, By the waters of Babylon, There we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. On the willows there we hung up our lyres, for there our captors required of us songs, and our tormentors mirth, saying, Sing us one of the songs of Zion. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a foreign land? If I forget you, O Jerusalem, let my right hand forget its skill. Let my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth, if I do not remember you, if I do not set Jerusalem above my highest joy. Remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem, how they said, lay it bare, down to its foundations. O daughter of Babylon, doomed to be destroyed, blessed shall he be who repays you with what you have done to us. Blessed shall he be who takes your little ones and dashes them against the rock. Now, I briefly mentioned this psalm last week, so we won't spend a lot of time on it. The historical background is that this is the southern tribe of Judah. Judah is the house of David. This is where Jerusalem is. This is where the temple is and the ark is. And in a Jewish mind, the temple is the only place on all of earth where God's physical presence is. And this has been taken from them. And during this time, God had warned them again and again and again to turn from their idolatry and to start serving him. The prophet Isaiah was sent to Judah during this time to warn them about what would happen. But Israel didn't listen to them. And so what we have are these people who have been captured by the Babylonians. And they have been brought out. They've been besieged for years. And they came down in 3 different waves. And they came down in chains and in shackles. And it says after they've given up everything, it says in verse 1, by the waters of Babylon, this is their captors, there we sat down and wept when we remembered Zion. When they remembered all that they had with the temple, with the miracles, with God's physical presence. But there's more to this, I think, when we begin to look a little more deeply at this. The first thing I'd like to point out is that they don't seem to miss God. They aren't very sad about losing God. I'm sure they're sad about Jerusalem and Zion. They mention Jerusalem twice. But they aren't very sad about missing God. They've just had their stuff taken from them. All the gifts that God had given them had been taken from them. God had told them that when he leads them into the promised land, if they continue to obey him, it's an inheritance of theirs forever. But it's now been taken away. The only mention of God is down in verse 7, where he says, remember, O Lord, against the Edomites. And the Edomites were descendants of Esau who had teamed up with Babylon to help demolish Jerusalem. It says, remember, O Lord, against the Edomites, the day of Jerusalem, how they said, lay it bare, lay it bare. Or I think the New American Standard says, raise it, raise it. They only want God to exact vengeance. They don't miss their relationship with God. They want God to be an attack dog, to go in and get the people who have done this to them. And so what we find is that it reads as if they miss their stuff, which makes sense because this is an idolatrous nation. Now, idolatry, I'd like to go off on just a very brief tangent just to help us understand this. I think we can understand this society a lot better when we understand what the biblical view of idolatry is, because we live in a very idolatrous nation. In fact, idolatry is not limited to worshiping statues. In Colossians 3 verse 5, Paul tells us that idolatry is covetousness. That the fact that you want something so much is a form of idolatry. And so what we find is that idolatry is when we love something more than we love God. When we hope in something more than we hope in God. And we trust in something to give us our daily needs, like our jobs and our families, more than we trust in God. These can be forms of idol worship. I'd like to demonstrate this for a moment and show you that we're to have a direct relationship with God. This is our reason for existing. Paul says this in 1 Corinthians chapter 8, verse 6. There's this chapter on idolatry and people eating food that had been offered to idols. And in the middle of this, Paul throws in this little theological nugget where he says, "Yet for us there is one God, the Father, from whom are all things, and for whom we exist. And one Lord Jesus Christ, through whom are all things, and through whom we exist." Our reason for being is to be in a relationship with God. And anything that gets in the way of that is bad for us. And so what we find is oftentimes we have our jobs get in the way between us and God. We begin to have more faith in our jobs to provide for our daily needs than God. Or maybe our family starts to get into the way. Or maybe even our jobs, our family, and the things we would like to do, our hobbies, begin to get in the way and begin to push our relationship with God farther and farther and farther away until we try to fit God in when we can, not understanding that when we do this, we're going against our very nature. Our reason for existing is to be in a right relationship with God. Now, it's not that these things are bad in and of themselves. Let's bring this back to the Israelites. The Israelites, worshiping Moloch and worshiping Baal was a bad thing. So you can't directly take this and replace that with this. But these things, jobs and families and hobbies, are not bad in and of themselves. What we see is instead, we should have a relationship with God that doesn't come between, our jobs and our families don't come between us and God. In fact, our relationship with God then feeds these other things and makes them better. But Israel was worshiping other gods because they wanted these gods to give them what they wanted. And they didn't just like worshiping these gods, they liked the drunkenness and the orgies and all these other things that came with worshiping these gods. And so what we see is Israel has been an idolatrous nation. They've forsaken God, and now they're mad about it. They're the ones who are being punished for what they knew was coming to them, and yet they cry out against the Babylonians and the Edomites that God should punish them. And I think we can understand this a little more if we understand that Israel was publicly disciplined. Have you ever been publicly disciplined? Ask my dad. I have. It's embarrassing. It's shameful. And when it happens, you get angry and you don't want the attention on you. You got to direct the attention to someone else. And you got to make it someone else's fault. The embarrassment is so overwhelming, it has to be an injustice done against you. And so they cry out that the Edomites need to be avenged for what they had done to Israel. And we need to understand that in an ancient mind, when something like this happened, it would often, I'm not going to say every time, it would often be one of these two things. It would either be their God was punishing them, which is why this is happening to Israel, or if two people were fighting in a battle and one won out, the one who won, their God was greater than the other God. They thought like this. And so God would use Israel to go into battle with all these other nations and defeat them to show them that it's not that their God was weaker than the God of the Israelites. It's that they had no God. The God of the Israelites was the only true God. And he was demonstrating this to all these people. This is why people were afraid of the Israelites. And we read that in the last few verses, they want their children dashed against the rocks. That's a horrible thing to ask of someone. Do you know what it means to be dashed against the rocks? In World War II, there's video footage of this. You can find it. I had to watch it in a class, where American Marines got into Saipan, and there are these Japanese civilians who are living there, and the Japanese civilians are so terrified of what the U.S. Marines are going to do to them because of all the lies they had been fed about what might happen if they're caught, that they jumped off of cliffs and fell 200 feet, men, women, and children, entire families, and were dashed on the rocks below. So when Israel is asking God to do this to them, they're asking for these people to pay in a horrible way for something that was Israel's own fault. And as we're going to see in just the next psalm, in Psalm 126, in here they're totally convinced that God can exact vengeance. But when we come to Psalm 126, they're surprised that they've been saved. They write as if vengeance is within God's control, but salvation isn't. And I think I know I find myself doing this at times, where I assume that something is within God's power, but something else isn't. As Brent says, we can't put God in a box. I'm actually about to put God in a box in just a second, you'll see. But we can't put God in a box. He can do anything. You can't just have faith that God can avenge you, but can't save you. And so what we have is Israel has had the Babylonians come down, take them in chains and in shackles, drag them publicly and humiliate them in front of all these other nations and bring them, and now the Israelites are in captivity. But in the captivity, we find some very interesting things. This story plays out almost like a 3-act structure. So in the captivity, first of all, we need to understand this is different than the Egyptian bondage. In the Egyptian bondage was about 400 years, but the Israelite captivity was only about 70 years. But what's interesting is that we actually have a record of what happens during this time. But it's also a little bit sad because Israel had already been let out of captivity once. At the end of Genesis, as Brent was speaking this morning, we see that Joseph becomes the ruler over all of Egypt. He is really high up. And then at the end of Genesis, we end with Israel and the sons all coming down, and they're saved. But then we begin with Exodus 1, and 400 years has passed, and suddenly Israel's in slavery, and we have no idea what happened. And God leads them out of this. But then even with this history of being let out of it and understanding that God had warned them what would happen, they were still led back right into it. But what's amazing is that God doesn't leave them through all of this. God gives them up to captivity. He gives up the temple, He gives up Jerusalem, He gives up the ark, He gives up the place of His very physical presence and leads them away to captivity, and then goes there with them. The books of Daniel and Esther were written during this time. In Daniel, we have prophecies, we have visions, we have miracles, where God is interacting in all these places. In the book of Esther doesn't even mention God one time. But in all of Esther, you can see God's handiwork playing itself out. God is with them in the captivity, behind the scenes, working toward their salvation. Because God had to take away all this stuff between us, them, and the Israelites, between Him and the Israelites, to show them their reason for being. All this stuff they had put in the way between them and God, God removed it. And He sent them into captivity and showed them that they need a direct relationship with God. He took away all their stuff so they can regain a personal relationship with Him and to experience His love. Because you can't just be told, I love you, and believe it fully. You have to be shown. And so they've been down into captivity. They're down there in captivity. They think God has forsaken them. God doesn't. He doesn't send them into a corner and say, come back and see me in 70 years. He goes down there with them and then helps work toward bringing them right back out. And then this is where we have Psalm 126. Let's read this. Psalm 126 It says, "When the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion, we were like those who dream. Then our mouth was filled with laughter, and our tongue with shouts of joy. Then they said among the nations, 'The Lord has done great things for us.'" The Lord has done great things for us. We are glad. "Restore our fortunes, O Lord, like streams in the Negeb. Those who sow in tears shall reap with shouts of joy. He who goes out weeping, bearing the seed for sowing, shall come home with shouts of joy, bringing his sheaves with him." This is a very different psalm than the one we just read right before they went into captivity. This is a nation who has been humbled, a nation who has had all their stuff taken away from them. And you'll notice that God is mentioned first. In verse 1, when the Lord restored the fortunes of Zion. God is the very first thing they mention. He wasn't even mentioned until verse 7 in the last psalm. We see that Jerusalem isn't even mentioned. Jerusalem was mentioned twice in the last psalm. And they said, if I forget you, let my tongue stick to the roof of my mouth and let my right hand forget its skill. And they barely even mention Zion. They only mention Zion in verse 1 in relation to God. They don't focus on God's gifts. They focus on God in verse 1. It's an amazing transition. And there's not even a hint of revenge. That's all they seem to care about. They spend 3 verses out of 9 covering revenge. That's 1/3. And this one, there isn't even a hint of revenge. They don't mention Babylon or the Edomites or what God should do to them. They're happy. They say the Lord has done great things for us, and we are glad. As we said before, it's unrealistic to them. Like they didn't expect to be able to be saved. They expected to be banished by God. That God gave up Jerusalem and the temple and the ark, but God instead went with them and showed them he has a direct relationship with them. He reestablished their reason for being. They say it's like those in a dream. And he did all this because Israel needed to be shown God's love. They can't just be told. We can tell each other, "I love you," all the time, and it's nice, it's reaffirming, and it makes us feel okay, but it's not the same as when someone shows you that they love you. And God has shown them beyond a shadow of a doubt that he loves them by taking all their stuff from them. I say they needed their distractions taken away. Do you know what the French word for entertainment is? It's amazing. You can look it up. There are multiple words, but the one that always stuck in my mind is it looks like it's written in English. It says, "les distractions." Well, the question really is, what are we distracting ourselves from? We're often distracting ourselves because we live in an idolatrous nation. We distract ourselves from the fact that we're going to die one day, that there's someone we're going to have to answer to. We distract ourselves from our reason for existing. That the reason we exist is to be in a relationship with our Creator. And God had warned them again and again. And God had told them again and again that he loved them. But they just still didn't believe it. You can read Isaiah sometime. Isaiah is a very moving book. There's so much emotion on God's behalf. He is hurt so much by what Israel is doing to them. And he cries out to them to come to him, to return to him. And they don't listen. He warned them and he told them, but they had to be shown. I say, but the hand rises. Does anyone know what this? It reminds me of, as I'm going through this, there's a part of it that reminds me of sort of the very end of horror movies. You know, they're like the group of kids or the people will defeat the monster, they'll defeat the killer, and they'll take it and they'll go and bury it. And the last 3 seconds of the film will be a zoom in of the shallow grave, and a hand will come up. Like evil has not been vanquished. It'll come back to haunt them. Because I'm reading 126, and I go to verse 4. And it says, "Restore our fortunes, O Lord, like streams in the Negeb." And I think, no, you don't need stuff. You need God. But this is what Israel's relationship was like with God. It was back and forth. God helped them, and they understood that God loved them. And then they went back to idolatry, and then God sent them away and then took them. It was just back and forth and back and forth. And the reason all this happens, the reason it's all back and forth, is because they don't have the revealed word like we do. Because all of this was just a shadow of something much, much greater. Because it was all ultimately fulfilled in Christ. Now this is when I love the Bible. When it gets so interesting, because there are all these little Easter eggs where you go through it and you go like, oh, there's Jesus. Oh, there's Jesus. Oh, there's Jesus. Like he was there the whole time. How did we not see it? And all of this, Israel going into specifically this Babylonian captivity, we'll look at this, was leading them to show them what God would ultimately do through Christ. Because all of us are in the captivity of sin. Now, it's one thing to be in chains and shackles and in prison in another country, but everyone is in chains and shackles and imprisoned by their sin and their desires. We read in Romans chapter 3, verse 23, "For all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God." And we read in John 8:34, Jesus answered them, "Truly, truly, I say to you, everyone who practices sin is a slave to sin." Sin enslaves us. It ensnares us. I mean, when we sin, don't we want to do it again? I know there are times where I've had this thought of like, well, if I just do it this one time and get it out of my system, then I'll be okay. And that's the worst thing you can do. Because you do it that one time, and suddenly you're in it deeper and deeper and deeper, and you can't stop. It's something bigger than us. All are in the captivity of sin. And it's actually the worst kind of captivity because we think we're free. While we're in the middle of it, we think we're free. We just don't know how enslaved we are. It's like the Matrix, right? Once you're unplugged from the Matrix, suddenly you're like, how can I ever go back? We're all enslaved by this, and you don't see it until you've been removed from it. I liken this often when I used to teach a high school college class in Boise to when you watch a movie. You know, sometimes you watch a movie and you're so engrossed in the movie that you forget you're even watching a movie. But then there are other times where you're watching it and you remember, oh, these are actors, they're saying lines, they're film directors, they're boom mics, there are all these things going on. It's a production. We can't lose ourselves in the movie. We have to always remember what's going on. Because otherwise, we don't understand just how dangerous our captivity really is. And just as with the Israelites, God is with us in our captivity. Jesus came down in flesh and came to us and then died for us. Let's read Romans chapter 5, starting in verse 6. We're just going to read 6, 7, and 8. Romans chapter 5, starting in verse 6 says, "For while we were still weak, at the right time Christ died for the ungodly. For one will scarcely die for a righteous person, though perhaps for a good person one would dare even to die. But God shows his love for us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." While we were still in captivity, Christ came down to us. Just as God went into Babylon and was with them and worked miracles all through Daniel, and you can see his providence all through Esther. God is with us in our captivity. And he did this so that we could experience his love. I say not just read about it. I mean, obviously we have to read about it. What I mean is, this isn't 2,000 pages of I love you over and over. God isn't sending an I love you note to us. He's showing us through history. There are verifiable historical documents about so much of this that we can't deny. And God is showing us through history that he loves us. He's not just telling us as if he were speaking through a prophet. He is showing us so that we will be convinced beyond a shadow of a doubt. And we see that just as with the Babylonian captivity, that God gave up the temple there, God ultimately gives up the temple in Jerusalem. It's destroyed in 70 AD. Turn with me to Matthew chapter 24. Matthew chapter 24, we'll read the first 2 verses. Jesus left the temple and was going away when his disciples came to point out to him the buildings of the temple. But he answered them, "You see all these, do you not? Truly I say to you, there will not be left here one stone upon another that will not be thrown down." I wish I had an image of this. Have you ever seen the temple that Herod built that was out during Jesus' time? It's massive. It's huge. And they were amazed by this. But Jesus prophesies here, ultimately it was destroyed in 70 AD. God did away with the temple, right? In the Babylonian captivity, God does away with the temple and then goes to them in their captivity. With Jesus, God does away with the temple and then comes and dwells with us. He's restoring his relationship with us by taking the things that come between us and him. You see? God shows us his love through Jesus, because what we have before is an idolatrous nation. What we have before is a nation that's very similar to ours, where there are things and stuff that distracts us and comes between us and God. And God was using all of this to show you, you may like this. You may like your jobs, your family. Those are okay things. You may like Moloch and Baal. Those are bad things. But all of this comes down to the fact that there's us and there's sin between us and God. And sin is bigger than we are. It enslaves us and it takes us captive. But God is bigger than it. And this is where I put God in a box. But God shows us his love through Jesus. And that this thing that binds us, that we can't get rid of, these shackles and these chains, he took off of us and he put on himself in order to overcome it. And now our relationship with God is even closer than it was before. God was reestablishing our purpose in life. That we have been created we exist to be in a relationship with our Creator. And when we don't do that, we're going against our very nature. And that's when things go wrong. We need to always be reminded of this. I always need to be reminded of this because it's a distracting world out there. It distracts us. It makes us lose sight. But our reason for existing is to be in a right relationship with God. And he made that possible through Jesus. Now, if you are in a right relationship with God and you need help in any way, or if you're not, if you would like to better understand what it means to be in a relationship with God, this is what the church is here to do. There are many people here who can help you better understand this. If there's anything at all that the church can do for you, we'd ask that you'd either come forward now or talk to us as we stand and sing this song.